What if I told you that within the DNA of the Portuguese people lies an untold story of migrations, cultural exchanges, and ancient civilizations? A story that spans tens of thousands of years, reaching back to the Ice Age and beyond. Portugal's unique position at the western edge of Europe has made it a genetic crossroads, where countless cultures and peoples have left their mark, each one adding a new chapter to the country's hidden history. Think about it. How did a small nation at the tip of the Iberian Peninsula become such a rich tapestry of genetic diversity? What secrets are buried in the genes of the Portuguese that connect them to the Celts, the Romans, the Moors, and even the Berbers of North Africa? With the advent of ancient DNA studies, science has finally begun to unravel these mysteries. Researchers have been able to trace the Portuguese genetic lineage back tens of thousands of years, uncovering fascinating links to early humans who sought refuge in Iberia during the Ice Age. But it's not just ancient migrations that shaped the DNA of the Portuguese people. Centuries of conquest, exploration, and even global trade during the Age of Discovery added layers of complexity to this genetic story. This is a history not just of migration but of resilience, a legacy of cultures blending together, forming a unique identity that continues to thrive today. So, what can DNA tell us about the origins of the Portuguese? And what surprises might still be hidden in the genetic code of this remarkable nation? Stay with us as we dive into the hidden history of Portuguese genetics, revealing how ancient migrations, groundbreaking discoveries, and unexpected influences shaped not just a people, but a legacy that continues to connect Portugal to the world. The story of the Portuguese people begins long before the first written records. To uncover their origins, we need to journey back tens of thousands of years, to a time when early humans were just beginning to populate Europe. Around 35,000 to 40,000 years ago, the first modern humans arrived in the Iberian Peninsula, migrating from other parts of Europe. These people were part of a larger wave of migration that spread across the continent, and they found refuge in Iberia during the harsh Ice Age. In fact, northern Iberia, including parts of what is now Portugal, became a major sanctuary where populations survived and later expanded back into Europe. This makes Portugal one of the key regions in understanding the genetic legacy of Europe's Paleolithic inhabitants. What's fascinating is that remnants of these early populations still persist in Portuguese DNA today. Genetic studies reveal a significant continuity of Upper Paleolithic Magdalene ancestry in the modern population. These lineages serve as a living connection to the people who hunted, gathered, and thrived in the shadow of glacier, shaping the foundation of what would become Portuguese genetics. But the story doesn't stop there. Roughly 10,000 years ago, a monumental shift occurred, the Neolithic Revolution. This was the age when farming and settled communities began to take root, transforming not just the way people lived, but also their genetic makeup. Farmers from Anatolia, in what is now modern-day Turkey, made their way into Iberia, bringing with them new agricultural techniques and a wave of genetic diversity. When these Neolithic farmers arrived, they didn't replace the existing populations entirely. Instead, they intermingled with the local hunter-gatherers, creating a unique genetic blend that persists to this day. One fascinating aspect of Neolithic Portugal was the practice of patriarchality, where women would migrate to marry into local male-dominated communities. This practice left a clear imprint on the Y chromosome lineages, preserving the genetic contributions of local men while introducing new maternal lineages from elsewhere. These early migrations set the stage for millennia of genetic evolution. What we see in Portuguese DNA today is a snapshot of these ancient interactions, a story of survival, adaptation, and cultural exchange. It's a reminder that the roots of the Portuguese people run deep, connecting them to some of the earliest chapters in human history. But how did these ancient lineages evolve over the millennia? And what role did later migrations, such as the arrival of the Celts and Indo-Europeans, play in shaping the genetic tapestry of Portugal? Stay tuned as we uncover the next chapter in this hidden history. As the ancient world transitioned into the Bronze Age, new waves of people began arriving in the Iberian Peninsula, carrying with them advanced technologies, languages, and cultures. Among these were the Indo-European-speaking migrants from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Their arrival around 3,000 years ago marked one of the most transformative periods in Portuguese history, and their genetic legacy can still be traced in modern Portuguese DNA. These migrants brought with them the R1b haplogroup, a genetic marker that remains dominant in Portugal today. This lineage spread rapidly across Western Europe during the Bronze Age, and in Portugal, it became the backbone of the population's genetic identity. But what truly set this era apart was the emergence of the Celts, whose arrival added another rich layer to the genetic and cultural tapestry of the Iberian Peninsula. The Celts were a group of tribes known for their warrior culture, artistic traditions, and shared language. In Portugal, they left a lasting impression, particularly in the northern and central regions. Tribes like the Galicians, Turduli, and Celtici settled in what is now northern Portugal and Galicia, forming distinct communities that thrived for centuries. But the influence of the Celts wasn't just cultural, it was deeply genetic. Studies have shown that the Celts brought new maternal and paternal lineages into the Iberian Peninsula, blending with the existing population and further diversifying the genetic pool. Interestingly, genetic links between the modern Portuguese and the Celtic populations of Ireland, Scotland, and northern Spain are still evident, highlighting a shared heritage that stretches across the Atlantic facade. One of the most intriguing aspects of Celtic influence in Portugal is the evidence of genetic continuity in the northwest. This region, known for its rugged landscapes and isolated communities, served as a genetic cul-de-sac where ancient lineages persisted with little outside interference. Even today, genetic studies reveal that people from northern Portugal share closer ties to ancient Celtic populations than to Mediterranean groups further south. The Celts didn't just bring genes and culture, they also introduced new technologies and social structures. Their mastery of ironworking revolutionized tools and weaponry, while their communal lifestyles and tribal governance shaped the early identity of the region. Over time, these influences blended with local traditions, creating a uniquely Iberian version of Celtic culture. While much of the Celtic heritage in Portugal is still being uncovered, one thing is clear. Their arrival marked a pivotal moment in the genetic and cultural evolution of the Portuguese people. The Celts left behind not just artifacts and myths, but a living legacy embedded in the DNA of modern-day Portugal. So, what happened next? How did the arrival of the Romans and later the Germanic tribes reshape the genetic landscape of Portugal? Join us as we dive into the next chapter of this fascinating journey. By the time the Romans set their sights on the Iberian Peninsula in the 2nd century BCE, the region was already a rich mosaic of cultures, shaped by the migrations of hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, and Celtic tribes. But the Roman conquest would mark a turning point, leaving an indelible mark on the people, culture, and genetics of what we now call Portugal. When the Romans arrived, they brought more than just armies. They introduced a way of life that would transform the Iberian Peninsula, from architecture and governance to language and religion. The people living in Lusitania, the Roman province that covered much of modern-day Portugal, were gradually Romanized. This process introduced Vulgar Latin, which would later evolve into Portuguese, and a wave of genetic contributions from across the Roman Empire. Roman soldiers, settlers, and traders arrived from diverse regions, including Italy, North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Gaul. This influx of new populations introduced fresh genetic lineages into the Iberian Peninsula. Roman-era remains from sites like Idanja e Velha reveal an extraordinary level of genetic diversity, with DNA evidence pointing to individuals of African, Mediterranean, and European origins coexisting in the same communities. But the Roman era wasn't just about blending cultures, it also brought significant infrastructure and agricultural innovations. These advancements helped stabilize the region, allowing populations to grow and thrive. Over time, the genetic makeup of the local population began to reflect this Roman influence, blending the indigenous Celtic and Iberian lineages with those of the newcomers. The fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century CE set the stage for another dramatic shift in Portuguese history. As Roman authority crumbled, waves of Germanic tribes swept across the Iberian Peninsula. The Suebi, Visigoths, and Vandals arrived as ruling elites, bringing new cultural traditions and leaving a clear genetic footprint in the region. Of these groups, the Suebi had the most enduring influence in Portugal. Establishing their kingdom in the northwest, they integrated into local communities over time, and their presence is still detectable in the Y chromosome lineages of modern Portuguese men. Genetic studies have shown that the Suebi and other Germanic tribes contributed unique markers to the Portuguese gene pool, particularly in the north, where their impact was strongest. It's fascinating to note that these Germanic tribes didn't completely erase the Romanized culture of the region. Instead, They merged their traditions with those of the existing population, creating a hybrid culture that would pave the way for the medieval kingdoms of Iberia. The Visigoths, for instance, adopted Latin as their language and Christianity as their religion, further blending their legacy into the Iberian tapestry. This period of Roman conquest and Germanic migrations laid the groundwork for much of Portugal's genetic and cultural identity. It was a time of integration and transformation, where ancient lineages coexisted and mingled with those of newcomers, creating a complex and enduring heritage. But the story doesn't end there. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the arrival of the Moors during the Islamic conquest reshaped the genetics and culture of Portugal yet again. What new influences did they bring? And how did these changes persist into modern times? Stay tuned as we uncover this fascinating part of Portuguese history. In 711 CE, the Iberian Peninsula entered one of its most transformative periods. The arrival of the Moors, Arab and Berber forces from North Africa, brought sweeping changes that reshaped the region's culture, architecture, and, of course, its genetics. For nearly 5 centuries, Moorish influence defined the identity of what would later become Portugal, leaving traces that can still be seen and felt today. When the Moors crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, they brought with them advanced knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and agriculture, revolutionizing the way of life in Iberia. But what's often overlooked is how their arrival introduced new genetic lineages to the region. Studies of Portuguese DNA show a small but significant contribution from North African populations, particularly in the southern regions, where the Islamic influence was strongest. The genetic legacy of the Moors is most evident in the prevalence of haplogroups J and E3b, both of which are associated with North Africa and the Mediterranean. These lineages reflect the arrival of Berber and Arab populations who settled in Iberia during the early years of the Islamic conquest. While these haplogroups are present across Portugal, they are noticeably more concentrated in the south, a region that remained under Moorish control for the longest period. But genetics only tell part of the story. The Moorish era was also a time of cultural coexistence. For centuries, Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side in what historians often call convivencia. This cultural exchange enriched the region's traditions, art, and even its language. Many Portuguese words, such as azeite, olive oil, and almofada, pillow, have Arabic origins, highlighting the deep linguistic influence of this period. Archaeological evidence from Moorish cities like Silves and Evora reveals how advanced urban planning, irrigation systems, and agricultural techniques transformed the landscape of southern Portugal. These innovations not only improved the quality of life but also helped sustain larger, more diverse populations, further blending the genetic makeup of the region. Interestingly, while the Moors brought new influences, they also preserved and enhanced local traditions. For example, the region's distinctive architecture, with its whitewashed walls, intricate tile work, and arched doorways, is a fusion of Moorish aesthetics and Iberian styles. This blending of cultures created a unique identity that set Portugal apart from its neighbors. However, the Moorish period wasn't without its tensions. By the 12th century, the Christian Reconquista had gained momentum, pushing back Islamic rule and reclaiming territory. Northern Portugal, which had experienced less Moorish influence, became the center of this resistance. The eventual fall of the Moorish stronghold in the Algarve in 1249 marked the end of Islamic rule in Portugal, but the cultural and genetic legacy of the Moors remained deeply embedded in the southern part of the country. Today, genetic studies confirm that while the Moorish contribution to Portuguese DNA is relatively small, it is a vital part of the nation's story. It serves as a reminder of the centuries of exchange and coexistence that shaped Portugal into the rich and diverse society it is today. But what happened after the Moors? How did the next chapter in Portuguese history, the age of exploration and the rise of the Sephardic Jewish community, shape the country's genetic legacy even further? Join us as we unravel this fascinating story. For centuries, Portugal was home to one of the most vibrant and influential Jewish communities in Europe. The Sephardic Jews, named after the Hebrew word Sepharad, meaning Iberia, left a profound mark on the culture, economy, and even the genetics of the region. Their legacy is a testament to the deep connections between faith, migration, and history, woven into the very fabric of Portugal. The Jewish presence in Iberia dates back to at least the 3rd century AD, long before the Moorish conquest or the rise of the Christian kingdoms. By the Middle Ages, the Sephardic Jews had become an integral part of Portuguese society, excelling as merchants, scholars, scientists, and physicians. Their contributions were vital to Portugal's rise as a maritime power, particularly during the Age of Exploration. But their influence wasn't just cultural, it was genetic. Haplogroups like J and E3b, associated with the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern regions, are markers of Sephardic Jewish ancestry. Studies have shown that these genetic signatures are still present in modern Portuguese populations, especially in regions where Jewish communities thrived, such as Lisbon and the Algarve. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Sephardic Jewish legacy in Portugal is their role in fostering innovation. Jewish astronomers and cartographers played a key role in advancing navigation techniques, while Jewish financiers helped fund Portugal's ambitious expeditions to the New World and beyond. These achievements were made possible by a unique period of coexistence, when Jews, Christians, and Muslims worked side by side, sharing knowledge and expertise. However, this golden age came to a tragic end in 1496, when King Manuel I issued an edict expelling all Jews from Portugal unless they converted to Christianity. This marked the beginning of a dark chapter, as thousands of Sephardic Jews fled to other parts of Europe, North Africa, and the Ottoman Empire. Those who stayed often converted to Christianity, becoming what were known as New Christians or conversos, though many secretly maintained their Jewish traditions. Even in exile, the Sephardic Jews carried their Portuguese roots with them. Communities in Amsterdam, Istanbul, and beyond continued to speak Ladino, a language rooted in medieval Portuguese and Spanish. These diaspora communities also preserved Portuguese surnames like Pereira, Mendes, and Lopes, which are still common among Jewish families today. But the story doesn't end with the Inquisition. Remarkably, the genetic and cultural influence of the Sephardic Jews persisted in Portugal, even after centuries of persecution. Modern genetic studies reveal that a significant portion of the Portuguese population carries Sephardic Jewish ancestry, a silent yet enduring legacy of those who once called Iberia home. In recent years, Portugal has sought to reconcile with this past. In 2015, the government introduced a law granting citizenship to descendants of Sephardic Jews who were expelled during the Inquisition. This gesture of reconciliation has led thousands of people from around the world to reconnect with their Portuguese roots, bringing the story of the Sephardic Jews full circle. The Sephardic Jewish heritage is a poignant reminder of the resilience of a community that has endured immense challenges while contributing so much to the world. Their legacy lives on in Portuguese surnames, DNA, and cultural traditions, offering a powerful connection to a shared history. But the next chapter in Portuguese genetics is even more complex. What happened during the Atlantic slave trade, when Portugal became a hub for global commerce and migration? How did this era reshape the genetic map of the country? Stay with us as we uncover the far-reaching impacts of this pivotal period. In the 15th century, Portugal stood at the forefront of maritime exploration. Its sailors ventured into uncharted waters, connecting Europe to Africa, Asia, and the Americas in ways that would change the world forever. But alongside these groundbreaking discoveries came one of history's darkest chapters, the Atlantic slave trade. This period not only reshaped global economies but also left a lasting imprint on the genetic fabric of Portugal itself. It began in 1444, when Portuguese ships reached West Africa and established trade routes along the coast. While gold, ivory, and spices were key commodities, the trade in human lives quickly became central. Over the next 3 centuries, Portugal was responsible for transporting millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, with many passing through its ports in Lisbon, Lagos, and Madeira. But what many don't realize is that some of these enslaved individuals remained in Portugal. By the 16th century, Lisbon had one of the largest African populations in Europe, with enslaved and free black individuals living and working alongside Portuguese citizens. Historical records show that African communities were particularly concentrated in urban centers, where they contributed to the labor force and cultural life. The genetic impact of this period is undeniable. Studies of Portuguese DNA reveal clear traces of sub-Saharan African ancestry, particularly in southern Portugal and the island regions of Madeira and the Azores. Maternal DNA, mtDNA, analysis highlights a significant presence of African haplogroups, suggesting that many African women were brought to Portugal during this time. This is a poignant reminder of the gendered nature of the slave trade, as enslaved women were often forced into domestic roles or other forms of servitude. In Madeira, the influence is especially pronounced. The island served as a key hub for sugar plantations, which relied heavily on enslaved African labor. Over time, the genetic contributions of these individuals became interwoven with the local population, creating a unique blend of European and African lineages that persists to this day. But the story doesn't end with the forced migrations of the slave trade. As time passed, African communities in Portugal began to integrate into society, leaving their mark on Portuguese culture. From music and cuisine to religious practices, the influence of African traditions can still be seen in modern Portugal. Even fado, the nation's iconic music genre, carries echoes of African rhythms and storytelling. What's particularly striking is how these genetic and cultural influences endured, even after the abolition of slavery. Although the transatlantic slave trade officially ended in the 19th century, the legacy of those who were brought to Portugal during this period lives on in the DNA of the modern population. Today, many Portuguese citizens carry small but significant traces of African ancestry, a testament to centuries of migration, resilience, and adaptation. The Atlantic slave trade is a sobering chapter in the history of Portugal's genetic story, reminding us of the human cost of empire and exploration. Yet it also highlights the interconnectedness of cultures and the enduring contributions of African communities to Portuguese society. But the next phase in Portugal's history would take this story even further. During the Age of Exploration, Portugal became a global superpower, spreading its culture, genes, and traditions to the farthest corners of the earth. How did this era of global exchange shape the Portuguese genome? Stay tuned as we dive into the next chapter of this incredible journey. The 15th and 16th centuries marked a defining era for Portugal. Known as the Age of Exploration, this period transformed the nation from a small kingdom on the edge of Europe into a global superpower. Portuguese ships sailed farther than ever before, charting routes to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But this age of discovery wasn't just about maps and trade routes. It was about people, ideas, and genes crossing borders. As Portuguese explorers ventured into uncharted territories, they created new links between continents, forging a vast colonial empire. Settlers, soldiers, and traders spread Portuguese culture and language across the globe, while bringing back influences from the places they explored. This two-way exchange left an indelible mark on the genetic and cultural fabric of both Portugal and its colonies. One of the most fascinating examples of this exchange is found in the Azores and Madeira. These islands were key stops on Portuguese voyages, attracting settlers from mainland Portugal and beyond. Genetic studies reveal traces of Flemish ancestry, particularly in the Azores, where Flemish settlers married Portuguese women during the early colonization period. Over time, the populations of these islands became a unique blend of European, African, and, in some cases, South American lineages. But Portugal's global reach extended far beyond the Atlantic. In Africa, Portuguese settlers intermarried with local populations, particularly in Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde. This blending created diverse Luso-African communities whose influence persists in the genetic profiles of modern Portuguese. Haplogroup analysis shows that African contributions, introduced during this era, remain a distinct yet subtle part of Portugal's genetic landscape. In Asia, Portugal's influence reached as far as India, where the city of Goa became a thriving hub of trade and cultural exchange. Portuguese settlers married into local communities, creating mixed heritage groups like the Luso-Indians. The genetic legacy of this exchange can still be seen in certain mitochondrial DNA lineages found in Portugal today, which trace their origins back to South Asia. Similarly, in Macau, Portuguese settlers established a unique community that blended European and Chinese ancestry, resulting in the distinct Macanese culture. Meanwhile, in the Americas, the Portuguese colony of Brazil became the largest source of genetic exchange. Millions of Portuguese settlers migrated there during the colonial period, intermingling with indigenous peoples and African slaves brought over through the transatlantic trade. The result was one of the most genetically diverse populations in the world, with Portuguese DNA forming a foundational layer. Interestingly, some of this diversity came full circle, as returning settlers and their descendants brought elements of Brazilian ancestry back to Portugal. The genetic impact of Portugal's global connections wasn't limited to human populations. the movement of crops, animals, and even diseases during this period, what historians call the Columbian Exchange, had profound effects on societies worldwide. Portugal's role in this process cemented its place in history as a bridge between continents, cultures, and peoples. Yet, despite these far-reaching connections, modern Portuguese genetics remains surprisingly cohesive. While there are clear markers of African, Asian, and indigenous American ancestry, they represent only a small fraction of the Portuguese genome. This speaks to the resilience of the country's ancient genetic foundations, even in the face of centuries of global exchange. The age of exploration was more than just an era of discovery. It was a turning point that wove Portugal into the fabric of global history. Its legacy lives on in the genetic diversity of the modern Portuguese population, a reminder of a time when the country's ships connected the world like never before. But how does this legacy compare to the genetic makeup of other European populations? And what makes Portuguese genetics truly unique? Stay with us as we uncover the final chapter of this extraordinary story. Today, the Portuguese genome tells a remarkable story, a mosaic of ancient migrations, cultural exchanges, and historical events that shaped the nation over thousands of years. What makes Portuguese genetics so fascinating is how it reflects both a deep continuity with Europe's past and unique influences from its position as a crossroads between continents. At the core of modern Portuguese DNA is the R1b haplogroup, which dominates the Y chromosomes of men across the country. This lineage, shared with much of Western Europe, is a relic of the Indo-European migrations during the Bronze Age, when people from the Pontic-Caspian steppe brought new languages, technologies, and genes to Iberia. The high prevalence of R1b in Portugal, particularly in the north, links the Portuguese to other Atlantic populations, including the Irish, British, and Basques. But Portugal's genetic story isn't defined by a single lineage. Haplogroups J and E3b, associated with the Mediterranean and North Africa, also feature prominently, reflecting millennia of migration and interaction. These lineages are more common in southern Portugal, where the genetic legacy of the Moors and Sephardic Jews remains strongest. This regional variation highlights how geography has shaped the genetic diversity within Portugal, with northern populations showing closer ties to Atlantic Europe and southern populations reflecting Mediterranean influences. One of the most intriguing aspects of Portuguese genetics is the evidence of ancient Paleolithic continuity. Studies show that many Portuguese individuals carry mitochondrial DNA markers that trace back to Ice Age refuges in northern Iberia. These lineages have persisted through waves of migration and conquest, forming a genetic backbone that connects modern Portuguese people to their prehistoric ancestors. Yet, Portugal's genetic mosaic is also marked by its more recent history. The Sephardic Jewish community, which thrived for centuries before the Inquisition, left behind distinct genetic markers, particularly among people in Lisbon and the Algarve. Similarly, the Atlantic slave trade introduced sub-Saharan African DNA, especially maternal lineages, into the Portuguese genome. This is particularly evident in Madeira and the Azores, where African influences are more pronounced. Global migration during the Age of Exploration added another layer of complexity. Genetic markers from South Asia, introduced by Portuguese settlers returning from Goa and other colonies, can still be detected in some modern Portuguese populations. Similarly, traces of indigenous American ancestry, likely brought back from Brazil, hint at the far-reaching connections of Portugal's colonial empire. Despite this diversity, Portuguese genetics remain remarkably cohesive when compared to neighboring populations. Nuclear DNA analysis shows that Portuguese people are most closely related to Spaniards, with shared ancestry dating back to the Roman and Visigothic periods. However, there are notable distinctions. Portuguese DNA has less Mediterranean influence than southern Spain and stronger ties to Atlantic Europe, reflecting the country's unique historical trajectory. Another fascinating discovery lies in the HLA haplotypes, genes linked to the immune system. Portuguese populations share certain rare haplotypes, such as A25B18DR15, which are found almost exclusively in Portugal. These markers may represent a founder effect, connecting modern Portuguese people to their ancient ancestors and highlighting the genetic uniqueness of the population. What's remarkable is how these genetic threads weave together to form a cohesive identity. The Portuguese genome is a testament to the resilience of ancient lineages, the influence of migration and conquest, and the enduring legacy of cultural exchange. It's a story that connects Portugal to its neighbors, its colonies, and the wider world, while also celebrating the distinctiveness of its people. As science continues to unlock the secrets of our DNA, new discoveries will undoubtedly add to this rich tapestry. But one thing is certain: the genetic story of Portugal is as dynamic and diverse as its history, a living reminder of the journeys, struggles, and triumphs that shaped this remarkable nation. As we've explored the hidden history of Portuguese genetics, one thing has become clear: the DNA of the Portuguese people is a unique blend, shaped by millennia of migration, conquest, and cultural exchange. But what exactly sets Portuguese genetics apart from other populations in Europe and beyond? Let's start with the concept of genetic continuity. One of the most striking findings about Portuguese DNA is its deep connection to the region's earliest inhabitants. The genetic signature of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who lived in Iberia tens of thousands of years ago is still present in the modern Portuguese genome. This continuity, spanning back to the Magdalene culture of the Ice Age, highlights Portugal as one of Europe's enduring genetic strongholds. Yet, Portugal's story is also one of diversity. Few other nations have experienced the same breadth of cultural and genetic influences. From the Celts to the Romans, the Moors to the Sephardic Jews, and the African and Asian communities introduced during the Age of Exploration, the genetic mosaic of Portugal is unparalleled. Each group left its mark, adding a unique layer to the country's DNA. One of the defining features of Portuguese genetics is its balance between ancient and modern contributions. Haplogroup R1b, a relic of Bronze Age Indo-European migrations, remains the dominant paternal lineage in Portugal, connecting the population to other Atlantic regions like Ireland and Galicia. Meanwhile, maternal lineages such as haplogroup J and E3b reflect Mediterranean and North African influences, particularly in the south. This dual heritage sets Portugal apart as both a genetic bridge and a boundary between Europe and its neighbors. Geography also plays a key role. The rugged mountains of northern Portugal have historically acted as a barrier, preserving ancient genetic lineages with minimal outside influence. In contrast, the southern plains and coastal regions have long been gateways for migration, fostering a higher degree of genetic diversity. This regional variation makes Portuguese genetics a microcosm of the Iberian Peninsula itself, unified yet distinct. Then there's the matter of HLA haplotypes, which provide another layer of uniqueness. These genes, associated with the immune system, are crucial for understanding how populations adapted to their environments over time. Portuguese populations exhibit rare haplotypes, such as A25B18DR15, which are found almost exclusively in Portugal. These genetic markers not only highlight the country's distinctiveness but also offer clues about ancient population movements and survival strategies. But what truly makes Portuguese genetics unique is how it reflects the nation's role in global history. Portugal's colonial empire brought about unprecedented genetic exchange, introducing traces of African, South Asian, and indigenous American ancestry into the Portuguese genome. While these contributions are relatively small, they represent a pivotal chapter in the country's history, one that connects Portugal to communities across the globe. What's more, Portugal's genetic makeup has influenced populations far beyond its borders. The Portuguese diaspora, driven by migration during the Age of Exploration and later economic hardship, spread Portuguese genes to Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Today, millions of people worldwide carry Portuguese ancestry, making the genetic legacy of this small nation a truly global phenomenon. Finally, what sets Portuguese genetics apart isn't just its diversity but its resilience. Despite centuries of migration, conquest, and exchange, the Portuguese genome has retained a remarkable sense of cohesion. Genetic studies consistently show that modern Portuguese populations are closely related to one another, sharing a core identity that links them to their ancient ancestors. In many ways, the genetic story of Portugal is a metaphor for its history, a nation defined by its openness to the world but grounded in deep, ancient roots. The DNA of the Portuguese people is a living archive, capturing the journeys, struggles, and triumphs of countless generations. It's a testament to the enduring legacy of a nation that has always stood at the crossroads of history. But what does the future hold for Portuguese genetics? As science continues to uncover new layers of our DNA, one thing is certain: the story of Portugal is far from over. Every genetic marker, every lineage, And every discovery brings us closer to understanding not just where the Portuguese come from, but what it truly means to be connected to the past. As we've unraveled the hidden history of Portuguese genetics, one thing is undeniable. Within the DNA of the Portuguese people lies the story of resilience, migration, and cultural exchange. It's a living testament to the human journey across millennia, connecting ancient Ice Age refuges to the globalized world of today. What makes this story so remarkable is how it blends continuity with transformation. The genetic legacy of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers remains deeply embedded in the Portuguese genome, forming a foundation that has persisted through waves of migration, conquest, and discovery. Each new chapter, from the arrival of the Celts and Romans to the influence of the Moors, Sephardic Jews, and Africans, added unique threads to this genetic tapestry without erasing what came before. The age of exploration amplified this legacy, as Portuguese sailors carried their genes, culture, and language across the globe. But just as the Portuguese left their mark on faraway lands, they also brought back traces of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, enriching the genetic mosaic of their homeland. Today, the Portuguese genome is a reflection of the nation's role as a bridge between worlds, where East meets West, and ancient meets modern. Yet, what's most striking is how this rich diversity coexists with a cohesive genetic identity. Despite influences from countless cultures, the Portuguese genome remains uniquely Portuguese, with markers and lineages that set it apart from its neighbors. It's a reminder of how deeply rooted the people of Portugal are in their land, even as their history has made them citizens of the world. But beyond the science, this is also a story of humanity. It's about how people adapt, endure, and thrive in the face of change. It's about connections that stretch across time and space, linking us to ancestors who lived in caves during the Ice Age, farmed the fertile plains of the Neolithic, and sailed uncharted seas in search of new horizons. So, what can we learn from the hidden story in our genes? Perhaps the greatest lesson is that our differences are not barriers but bridges. The Portuguese genome shows us how interconnected we all are, how every migration, every exchange, and every encounter leaves a mark that endures for generations. As we look to the future, the story of Portuguese genetics is far from finished. Advances in science will continue to uncover new details, deepening our understanding of the past and revealing even more about what makes the Portuguese people unique. And while DNA holds many secrets, one thing is certain: it tells a story of connection, resilience, and a shared humanity that binds us all. So, what do you think about this incredible journey through the past, encoded in our DNA? Are you surprised by the secrets hidden within Portugal's genetics? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're curious about your own genetic story, why not explore it? You might discover connections to history you never imagined. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time and genetics. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating discoveries. Until next time, remember, every gene tells a story, and every story brings us closer to understanding who we are.